In this Listen to Learn episode of the Share Life podcast, I'm speaking with Jesse Nigro. Jesse, say hello.
Hello.
Jesse is the editor-in-chief at the North American Anglican. Today, we're going to be speaking about Alasdair Macintyre's suggestion and after virtue, emotivism, the Enlightenment's failures, and whether we should choose Aristotle or Nietzsche. He lives in Omaha, Nebraska with his wife and children, where he teaches philosophy at a classical high school. Jesse has a BA in philosophy and an MA in theology. And if you're watching this on video, you may notice his daughter pop in or here or there, but so far she is just joining us in the background. So I want to start out, have a conversation about the kind of root problem that we want to sketch out, talk about transitioning away from that, how to interface while we are away from it, and then also talk about a Christian perspective as well. Um, so, Jesse, you wrote this four-part essay series on the North American Anglican website titled Secular Stories. And what I'd
Yeah.
like to do is to have you sketch out for us, what is Alasdair MacIntyre's suggestion? What is emotivism, as well as Max Weber's influence on it? What is voluntarism, and how it relates? And why is our missing telos a problem? So we'll
Yeah.
leave it there and let you start sketching that out for us.
Awesome. Yeah. It's well, there's lots to cover, and obviously, After Virtue is a big book, as you know,
Yeah,
and not only big but dense,
yeah.
in the sense that it, kind of expects a familiarity with a bunch of different schools of philosophical schools of thought. So, if you like to chase down footnotes and rabbit trails like I do, it's a lot of fun, and accessible too. I think it. If anyone in your audience is wondering, well, could I pick this up and understand it? I think you could. Quite a bit of it, and my purpose in writing these articles was in part not to be a replacement for reading After Virtue yourself, but I think hopefully to let people feel less daunted. But also primarily because I think it's in our day and age of ethical confusion and rhetorical, people just seem to be speaking past each other. This well, the dilemma, the problem that Alasdair MacIntyre describes seems fitting. So he borrows from science fiction and sort of describes this post-apocalyptic world where the world of scientific knowledge is basically someone has cobbled together the scraps of textbooks, and he describes, children are chanting or reciting incomplete periodic tables, right? People are saying that they talk about Einstein and Newton without really understanding what Einstein or Newton accomplished, because it's just what they have to work with. And they're trying to do science, but they don't even know what they don't know. They don't realize that not only are they not doing science, but they don't realize why they're not doing science, because they just utterly lack the context. And what MacIntyre does is he says, according to a certain kind of lingo, you could say that after the Matrix, he offers the red pill, like Morpheus, and says, here we are. Just so you know, what I'm describing is us when it comes to morality. He's saying that what we as a people do in the public square when we think we're debating moral issues is more or less what these imagined pitiable post-apocalyptic so-called intellectuals do when they recite equations they don't understand at one another.
Yeah.
He's saying that when we have debates about things like wage, minimum income or abortion or any of these things in our society, you have people that utterly lack the context from which these ethical theories sort of derive. And therefore, we speak past each other and we end up in shouting matches that, when the applause settles down, it was more or less who could shout better than rather than who
Hmm.
had the better argument.
Yeah, I think he calls it like shrillness.
Yes, and I think, boy, I mean, for a book that was written in the '80s, this is such a modern and contemporary and relatable passage, don't you think?
Yeah, it's interesting, because I read it within the last couple of years, but its relevance to today, it seems so obvious for me when I was reading it. Um, but I'd be curious if people, when they first read it, when it was first published, did it seem as obvious, or were some of the cracks that we now see that have opened up made it more obvious? So,
Right, absolutely. I think, if anything, I'm sure that, well, one problem with the problem that McIntyre identifies is that, um, you will be in a situation where you won't even realize that it's
mhm.
happened,
Yeah.
right? So, unlike in the sci-fi scenario where there's been a nuclear fallout and the evidence is everywhere, he says that when it comes to modern morals and moral theory, we don't even realize the explosions happened, but it
Hmm.
has.
And how it's affect us and how we operate as if it is the 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 foundation of our reasoning. And so we may think that we're morally reasoning in a particular way, but we don't even realize that we've accepted underlying assumptions and premises of this paradigm.
Yes, and I think, yeah, the paradigm that he identifies is that of emotivism,
Okay.
right? And that, as you say, there are convinced emotivists, right? They're
Yeah.
usually academic philosophers, but you don't have to even know what the word emotivism is, or understand it, or even agree with it to be, as McIntyre says, behaving as though it's true,
Yeah.
right? And we do that by, um, engaging in arguments. Maybe, I mean, I like to think of it this way: like, if I know my opponent doesn't share any of my starting principles, then what is it that I hope to achieve when I start a moral argument with them?
Yeah.
Right? Do I think that they will just throw down all of their core beliefs and adopt mine because I argued well about, I don't know, a loaf of bread or whatever happens to be at stake? And so, insofar as we're willing to engage in these moral arguments as though our radical differences don't matter, we're behaving like emotivism is true, according to
Hmm.
McIntyre. My
So how
understanding.
how would you how would you define emotivism if someone's like, well, what is that? Like, how do I make sense of that?
Right.
Or
Yeah. Great question. So emotivism is, as a philosophical position, this idea that people believe that whenever we're doing argument over a moral issue, we're basically just deep down asserting our preference,
Mhm.
right? It's you say that you've got all these arguments for why, abortion should be legal or illegal, or issues of immigration, or any other sort of hotly contended, topic. But deep down, you're just sort of arguing for whatever you want to be the case, and
Yeah.
you'll pull whatever tool out of your toolbox that you think will get you there. Is
Yeah.
is what the emotivist believes about moral discourse.
Yeah.
And
So
McIntyre
any
is saying,
justification is simply a cover story for what we want.
absolutely, it's about asserting your will. I want this
Yeah.
to be the case, and I'll just do whatever it takes to, make it the case, right?
So how would you so you talk about Max Weber's influence. Like how does he play into emotivism, or what's his role in fleshing emotivism out?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Weber or Weber or he's his influence comes in and is definitely underscored by Macintyre. In part, he belongs to this new way of understanding the world, which is sociological, and kind of this mechanistic view of humanity, where we can understand the sorts of things that humans are and what they ought to get up to by studying them the way you would a machine or anything else. Um, so yeah, the Weberian part, I think, connects to Macintyre really thinking that when you live in this emotivist world, whether people realize they're emotivist or not, what you've
Yeah.
done is you've rejected the theological view of humanity, which is to say that people and things have purposes. And the Weberian view is far more mechanistic, and you're trying to study humans the way you would ants,
Hmm.
and you don't necessarily have these moral obligations necessarily. You just kind of want to say, well, if I were to add this to their environment, they would behave this way or that way.
So, like, would you consider that like reductionism or compartmentalization? Is that kind of what you mean by that?
Well, it's definitely reductive, in the sense that modernity is kind of inherently reductive, and Weber is a materialist, right? He's an anti-supernaturalist. His whole point of doing sociology the way he does is to kind of take all our preconceived notions that came from a robustly Christian or metaphysical perspective and say, well, that was really a cover, right? That was a cover for this, was a cover for this, and peel back humanity
Mhm.
and
And
you
from
know,
his point of view, because he believes it is a cover story, it it is a cover story, right? If he's right, right?
if he's right, it's that then this is of course what you should do, right? And I think what McIntyre and others are sort of about is to say, well, why did we buy this assumption, right? Maybe we need to contextualize this assumption, which that it's all a cover story, right? And part of the way that McIntyre does that is through his sort of historical method of evaluating all of these philosophical schools. He wants to say, well, hey, let's. We already know we're in this mess. It's this apocalyptic moral mess, right? Well, how do we understand the present? We have to look back through history and kind of evaluate all these different schools in their own context that they arose, so we can get a bigger picture and do that evaluation. Like, well, maybe this is not all true, and maybe this one is, and how can we
Yeah.
know? Sorry, little girl is making some noise here.
She
But
has
how
something
can
to
we
contribute.
know unless we are able to take that step back? And he uses sort of the historical
Yeah.
method for doing that.
And it would almost seem the emotivists would want to push back even on that endeavor to say that history doesn't matter because it's again it's just another cover story.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you're committed to that, I mean, this is maybe one thing that people have pushed back on McIntyre and just said, well, he's great if you already are inclined to believe that sort of thing, but you wouldn't convince a skeptic necessarily.
Yeah.
Um, and that may be true. I'm not
Although to
sure.
some degree, I mean, McIntyre was the skeptic when he wrote After Virtue, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, and by skeptic I mean sort of the skeptic of virtue theory.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. He was not a professing Christian at the time, which is part of what makes the book so interesting to me. So maybe this is the point you're making, that even an atheist or an agnostic can come as far as Macintyre came
Yeah.
in After Virtue, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And I don't agree with all of his conclusions. I think that he does better after he converts and is able to sort of re-understand his project through Christian eyes. I think it helps him out
Mhm.
quite a bit.
Yeah. So how so what is voluntarism? How do you say it?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, voluntarism is this moral theory that basically morals come from directly from God. Moral imperatives are sort of just these laws, almost arbitrary laws, that it's just this is the way God wants it. We don't need to understand why or, contextualize it at all. What's demanded of us is obedience. Um, and you can kind of get this sense that this view of morality and God could make anything true if God
Yeah.
willed it to be. And one of the points that people who are, I'm not a voluntarist, would say is that, well, this means that God could make rape or murder or any kind of atrocious act morally good if he decided, if
Mm.
he decided it was the right sort of thing for the time. And one reason why,
Just
uh,
something else to say.
yeah, she's got lots to add. One reason why McIntyre sees this as sort of falling at the feet of the Protestant tradition is that it does sort of get some new life, you could say, after the Enlightenment from people like Soren Kierkegaard, for example, who uh, I'm sure you're familiar with sort of his telling of the Abraham and Isaac story, where
I, I,
Abraham, being the knight of faith, does the right thing even though he knew it was morally wrong, right?
mhm.
And so Kierkegaard calls that what the teleological suspension of the ethical. Um, so
And what does he mean
this
by that more specifically?
basically, because his telos is aimed at God, then that was to do what God wants you to do is good enough reason to suspend your moral or your
Mm.
ethical sort of beliefs.
Yeah. Well, it's
Um,
interesting that you say that because there's a book by Oswald Chambers called Our Ultimate Refuge, and it's about the story of Job. And that tension is what comes up at the very end of the book, in the very end
mm,
of the book of Job, which between Job and Elihu, and
mm,
essentially this idea of authority. And Job is essentially pushing back and say, well, God can't just be the authority; he has to be a worthy authority. Does that make sense?
mm. Yeah, well, that's interesting. Yeah, I think the Job book is fascinating on so many levels. It ultimately, even though I like Kierkegaard in many respects, I think he's fundamentally wrong on this issue of saying that necessarily we have to conclude that obedience to God, God's will, that voluntary part, required a dismissal of what you know to be ethically or morally true. I take a more sort of Thomistic, approach to these things, and I think that there are other ways to read that story. But when it comes back to Job, um, I mean, for instance, what is what does God say in the whirlwind there at the end? I mean, Job wants to know sort of the reason why all this bad stuff is happening, right?
Yeah.
And God's answer is not like what you'll hear from a Christian apologist sometimes, like, well, in order to preserve free will, I had to allow a certain amount of bad stuff to happen, or some of these other examples. What he says is, it's not for you to know, right? Where were you when I was knitting
Yeah.
reality together? You know, that's it's the answer is the sort of thing that people who were there for that event get to know about, right? Or fully understand.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess you could say that makes Job a voluntarist story, but I think that really it's not so much that we don't have to conclude from these things that God arbitrarily wills, but what we can conclude perhaps is that some things just by their nature will be beyond our understanding.
Yeah.
Um, that being said, I do believe sort of affirm the natural law tradition in morality, and I think there's plenty of things that by their nature are accessible to us, and God makes those accessible to us
Yeah.
for which allows perhaps that common moral sort of inquiry that McIntyre's worried about. And I think actually natural law is something that he did not seem to affirm as a non-believer in After Virtue, and would later kind of pick up. And I think it does flesh out his theory quite a bit,
Yeah.
because you get the sense that, like, in an Aristotelian fashion, he believes that virtue and communities of virtue are things that you're either busy building or else they'll just erode altogether and then you'll just be out of luck,
Yeah.
right? Whereas I think when you believe that there's God has created us with a certain innate abilities to kind of know and understand good from evil just from our experience of living in the world, is a little more optimistic, perhaps.
Yeah. There's more grounding to sustain it.
Right.
So so I want to I guess if you could dive in a little bit more specifically, like what is the problem with um the lack of the telos, like to lack that vision, to miss to not have it, or to reason morally without it? Like what is it that's the problem with doing that? Like why should someone
Yeah.
care to even consider that as
Sure. Well, I mean, I think uh, the telos is sort of that final cause of Aristotle's four causes. It's the one that tells you what this thing is for, right? And if we're thinking of human persons, then it makes a huge difference if you want to say, well, you ought to do this or you ought not to do that, if you think that we have like a purpose in general or not. Or if you think that as some modern philosophers would say, like, well, we just each have our own telos that is utterly unrecognizable from the others, right? They're unrelated, except that if you're human you have one, right? um, if humanity is, if we're all sort of created with certain purposes, then what we should be doing is going to be related to that, right? Well, we should be living in accordance with that telos, right?
well?
Now, you could say that as a Christian believers, our purpose is to know and love God, or be in a right relation with Him in some sense, ultimately. But I think that Aristotle has this other idea of the good life that is lived in the here and now. And I don't think those have to be sort of at odds. I think that we as Christian believers can certainly see, like, living in line with God's commands or laws or truths is sort of part of what we would call that eudaimonia, which is sort of that Greek word that Aristotle uses for the good life.
Okay. Yeah. So let's say we acknowledge, okay, hey, there is something wrong. The explosion has happened, so to speak.
Right.
And maybe I didn't know about this emotivism, or I didn't understand it, but I had some senses that sort of something like this was there, and I had some sort of senses towards a teleological way of thinking, whether I sort of use those words or not. So I've sort of bought into the premise here. There's a problem, and there's a better solution. So how does someone transition from being in the matrix to taking the red pill and sort of exiting it? Tell us about that transition process.
Sure. Well, I think it's yeah, this is maybe the most sort of poignant for our cultural and societal moment right now because it, you know, in the last few years, we've noticed what you might call sort of major glitches in the matrix, as
Yeah,
it were.
yeah.
I mean, more and more people are waking up and saying, "Well,
Deja
that's
vu.
not right."
Yeah.
Yeah, deja vu, right? Yeah, it's like, oh, I seem to remember there only being two suns last week, or whatever.
Yeah.
Like things are changing, and you could say that the Wizard of Oz, the curtain is being pulled back a little bit. So what do you do about that, right? And one thing that I appreciate about Macintyre so much is that as a sort of former Marxist who is interested in virtue, he has a lot to say with like the role of institutions in virtue and in sort of promoting a virtuous society or community. Um, Books have been written along these lines. His famous sort of concluding line of the book is saying that what we need is another Saint Benedict, right?
Yeah.
And Rod Dreher has written the book The Benedict Option, and so many people have sort of proposed like, well, what would it mean to be uh, living in the matrix, so to speak, but not of it?
Yeah.
Like what kind of communities should we be trying to form so that we can be resilient to, say, the forces, the prevalent forces of culture, which are sort of these institutionalized forms of emotivism or whatever, uh, in a way so that we can actually have sane conditions for moral living, if not for ourselves, then be a good influence to the rest of society. As far as how to do that or what to do, I mean, I think that one place where I'll agree with Dreher is that there is a need for kind of parallel institutions. If you become convinced that the school that you went to no longer, maybe it was established to teach truth and had a sort of the practice of education was there, and it was producing certain virtues that are specific to that practice, right? Well, what if you determine that this institution no longer serves its initial purpose or its founding principles and is no longer really aimed at truth, and that the virtues that used to be inherent to that practice of education are no longer going to be available to my kids, right? Well, I think that if you found yourself with that red pill in hand, so to speak, you may decide, well, I need to find or help build or invest somehow in an institution that can
Hmm.
achieve those ends in a way that I believe is faithful to the truth, and whether it be moral truth or any other kind. So, yeah, I think, some kind of, people of goodwill
Yeah.
really ought to be evaluating their institutions, saying, hey, is this thing still do, or did it ever do what I
Yeah.
really thought it was meant to do?
Yeah.
And if
Well,
your
how
answer
do
is
we,
no,
yeah, how do we differentiate between the fact that we may just be building another emotivist institution versus building a teleological one?
I mean, that's obviously, it's certainly a danger. I think that being aware of the possibility will so that's the thing with the historical aspect. Clearly, the founders of like Cambridge or Harvard or whatever, we're not thinking of emotivism becoming like like eventually people will come along and they'll not even realize, so they didn't even have the danger of this in mind.
Yeah.
So in some sense, I guess you could say that we have the benefit of hindsight, which is to say we've been able to see sort of civilization, Christendom even, rise and grow and flourish, but we've also been able to see failures. And one benefit of being this side of failures, like if you've determined that this emotivism is a problem, is that you can be wary of it, right? Maybe
Yeah.
even write policy, which is to say, like, this sort of doctrine or dogmatic thinking leads to this, and we're not about that here. If you want to do that, there's places for you, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. So how would you distinguish the difference between a Max Weber, Weber, how do you say it, Weber, um, organization versus an Aristotelian teleological business? Like, how would they
Sure.
practically function differently?
I mean, that's a cool question, because I think, well, first of all, I think most modern kind of bureaucratic institutions are Weberian, more or less.
Okay.
I think Macintyre says so, but I don't think that's even really very scandalous. I mean, someone will be mad, is like yelling right now, like, of course that's scandalous. But no, I think that the Weberian idea is sort of like, well, we'll just add some extra process, and we'll debate. We'll have experts of these different fields, and they'll sort of compare their notes, and then we'll determine where to go from there, sort of according to the big picture. But of course, that big picture is never like a real. What you do next at the organizational level of an institution always requires some kind of purpose, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's sort of, that's part of McIntyre's critique, is he's saying the sociological worldview, that of the social sciences, pretends to be this sort of objective, scientific. We're just going to analyze the way things are, and then determine, what seems best for next steps. And he's saying that basically, when you pretend there's no such thing as a telos, what happens is you get the sort of Nietzschean reaction, which is to say that someone with a will to power is going to come along and apply their will to this situation. And we'll all just be doing what they think we ought to do, regardless of what the sort of
Mm.
surfacey cover story is, right? So
Well,
in
and that
that
also
sense,
implies that there's no way to push back in terms of a transcendent moral value because it is a will to power, right?
yeah, and of course, most people who are involved in these kinds of projects are going to resist that claim that this is just raw will.
Yeah.
Um,
But
but
it's also in that sense, in a way that that's a lot of the Marxists out there now, socialists, that's the claim they're making, right? And in that sense, we actually have alignment with uh, the possibility of that paradigm, if that makes sense,
yeah, I think so. I mean,
in terms of
I
illuminating
think
the
that,
problem. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like, for Marx, I think he's actually a good study of sort of like how certain things, like his criticisms, I think, are very interesting. But ultimately, even at like the Communist Manifesto, the final lines are not workers of the world, throw off your shackles. It's like, yeah, you guys will continue to be the workers of the world. We'll just have a new aim, It's like, they're not going to really do away with
Yeah.
the industrialized, dehumanizing society. We got a new telos for you, right?
Yeah. So in
So
that
so
sense,
yeah.
it's nihilistic or it's fatalistic, right?
Well, it's definitely fatalistic, because they think it's inevitable.
Yeah.
Like, humanity is sort of evolving towards the communist
Mm.
utopia in that perspective, which has of course been a big frustration for the Marxist schools, and that's where you get the neo-Marxism,
Yeah.
of the Frankfurt School. Like, well, why hasn't this happened yet?
Yeah.
Well, it's these culture institutions that are propping up capitalism or the bourgeoisie or whatnot. And then, I mean, so this all ties into the issues of virtue, though, because then you had a whole bunch of scholars whose purpose was to target the institutions of Western cultures that were more or less maintaining
Yeah.
traditional ways of life. And so for that reason, I think McIntyre is really good at helping you figure out how to evaluate these institutions. But one thing he doesn't do a ton of is evaluating. Oh boy, I've got a complaint here. Evaluating how basically some of the work of deteriorating virtue and institutions and whatnot has been done quite purposely, and
Mm,
with a lot of agency and it wasn't just that, boy, the Enlightenment project didn't work out, right? It was also that there were people who didn't want this thing to work out. They're trying to, again, remove those mediating institutions so that they could bring about the telos that they wanted for mankind.
in terms of the telos, part of it is, I think the distinction is that the telos can't just be an arbitrary vision that we establish. It has to be in line with a higher transcendent order,
Mm-hmm.
or it's where it's problematic, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's where McIntyre does better after virtue, because he then begins to understand that it's not that just having a purpose or a set of virtues is important, but that some purposes are realer or truer or better than
Yeah.
others.
So I think part of what I would hear from you then is that in terms of the Weberian influence, the people that adopt that philosophy are interested in perpetuating the organization for its own sake and not for the sake of a telos that aligns with a transcendent vision, right?
Yeah. Yep. And it's definitely, we become cogs in the machinery of the organization, and it can very quickly become dehumanizing in that way.
Yeah. And in that sense, we also there's also the machine of our country, let's say America, and he talks about these different roles that we sort of play in perpetuating the machine versus actually questioning whether this is the machine we should be participating in or pushing back, right?
Yeah, I think that all of these sort of questions, when it comes to these specific institutions, we have to ask ourselves, is this do I have an allegiance or a loyalty that's due to this institution, or is this institution
Mm,
a stand-in for something that I do have a real, because I think that as someone who's born in this nation, I have there's something owed to me. You could say a pietas, in a sort of Aristotelian sense to my father, to my fatherland, to whatever. There's something in which you owe something to your community. It kind of helped bring you about, right?
yeah,
Um, but is that sort of piety that's owed? Is that specifically owed to the United States government in its particular form as it exists now? And I think that's a different conversation
yeah.
and requires for.
Well, yeah, that's interesting because it illuminates the loyalty can be to the organization or the entity, or it can be to the vision of which that entity and the values of which are held to of that entity. So it's a vehicle
Mm-hmm.
towards somewhere. Is my allegiance to the vehicle or to the destination? And I think that the danger of our allegiance to the vehicle is that when the vehicle goes off the road, we go off the road with it, and we can do some pretty terrible things right along with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's we've got all sorts of moral experiments that have been performed, where people were, well, the guy with the lab coat told me to shock the you know the innocent person, but
Yeah,
he did have a lab coat, so
yeah,
obviously people can do all sorts of awful things because they think they're doing their part within the system, right? I'm just
yeah,
doing my job, right?
yeah,
And that's a huge part of not only just a terrible moral situation that so many people are willing to behave that way, according to Macintyre, but it's also perpetuating this emotivist,
Yeah. Yeah.
morally
Keeps it going.
relativistic thing, right? Because people aren't thinking, well, what's the right thing to do here? What they're thinking is, what is my boss going to like? How am I
Yeah.
going to keep my job? There are other considerations that are more, relating to what's good for this, machine or
Mhm.
institution that are superseding that.
Yeah. So help us understand. Okay, so let's say we have transitioned. We've identified the problem. We've transitioned. We've sort of adopted a teleological way of looking at things, a virtue-oriented values. Um, if someone is in that place and they're interfacing with someone that is in the emotivist paradigm, and that how do we have that discussion with them, like you said, the debate, or how do we even work for a company that's like that? How do we interface with
Yeah.
different paradigms?
Well, this is a great question, and you've given me a little bit of time to think about it because you sent it in early, and I really appreciate that because I think this is maybe the hardest part is you know recognizing the problems, but then actually coming up with solutions is really tricky. And of course, it's very personal, right? I mean, I have people that are on the other side of these divides who are flesh and blood relatives or people I care quite a bit about. But we seem to be, miles and miles apart when it comes to some pretty important issues. Um, so one example that cropped up, perhaps providentially, but I saw today is this, and I can send you the link. This person named Daniel Kahneman, who he. So this is sort of an academic solution, right? He recommends adversarial collaboration on academic projects.
Okay.
So let's say that you're a utilitarian and I'm a Kantian deontologist, and there's a virtue ethicist here. Well, he's maybe doesn't have that in mind exactly, but he would say, why don't we get people involved at the research level at the very beginning who have different views, so that they're all sort of equally invested in the
Hmm.
project, I guess, rather than completely coming at it from your own school, your own wheelhouse, and then sort of throwing your assumptions at what they mean when they say this or that at them. You can have this sort of shared history of familiarity with the subject, which can, I think, has a lot of potential to allow people to have a more sympathetic, at the very least, it might not bridge the horizon, so to speak, but it might help you at least understand the other side better. That's a sort of, academic, uh, you know, uh, intellectual answer. But my heart tells me that the more, and this is something I wrote about in my thesis on secularity, in for my master's degree. But I think that the real trick here is in hospitality, which is to say, if our worldviews are so completely opposed that we I can well enough recognize that nothing I can say will convince you because we're operating from completely different founding principles of truth or heaven knows what else. The best way for me to actually win you over, to win someone over, would be to be able to host them, show them hospitality in an environment that is sort of wholly dedicated to or a product of or in alignment with these true things that I'm sort of that we're disagreeing about, right?
Yeah.
So here's one example. If I have a disagreement with someone on an issue, a social issue that's, say, regarding marriage, right? Many Christians or conservatives have how to disagree when it comes to something so personal. Um, but for instance, if my position is there are certain things that we ought to do and certain things that we ought not to do, the best way to convince someone I'm not just trying to be mean when I say you ought not to do this would be maybe to have you over for dinner and actually model what the fully fleshed out positive view is that I'm attempting to win you toward. It's not anti-intellectual, but it's not 100% cognitive either. I think that we have to recognize the important role of pathos in rhetoric, and that there's a sense in which it's not emotivist to say that a lot of people believe what they believe for emotional reasons,
Yeah.
but to sort of understand that, as Thomas Cranmer, the great theologian of the 16th century, is said, that what the heart wants, the mind justifies, and the will pursues, right?
Yeah.
And that's not to say that we can't sort of just want the truth. So, but most people, they need to see sort of the heart side of it. Like, what is it that you're so passionate about? Is it that you just don't like the way other people are doing things? Is it really emotivism deep down? It's like, no, I actually there's an ordered sort of view of the cosmos that I believe in, and if I can cultivate a place, whether it's in my home or in my church or at the local, bowling team or whatever, coffee shop, whatever it is, where that vision of the cosmos is shared by a community, then that's the sort of thing that can really open people up to the possibility, I think. You have these sort of uh, the architecture of plausibility, right?
Yeah.
It becomes plausible because, oh, now I've actually seen people living as though this is true, and it's not repugnant, right? It seems even possible that it is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because what I'm hearing from you is creating, part of it is about creating the type of order, the type of paradigm that we're talking about, at least within a sense of where we can control that. Maybe it's
Right.
our home, our community, the part of work that we might have authority over.
Mm-hmm.
And um and to model that and for that living example to be um enough of attention to sort of give us a hearing, like, hey, what I'm trying to create is this, and if this is of value to you, maybe you be interested in being someone who
Mm-hmm.
creates this type of thing too.
Absolutely. Because, I mean, what seems logical or plausible out in the middle of the street or doesn't seem plausible could look very different with different lighting or with the right people in the room.
Yeah.
You know, I almost think of it as like I'm not a huge sports guy, but if I'm with a friend who really loves a team, like I can get caught up in whatever it is that they love about this
Yeah.
and enjoy a game. And similarly, if under the right conditions and in an environment that's sort of cultivated according to that paradigm, a particular paradigm, which you happen to believe to be the true one, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you ought to have good reasons for that, so we don't want to be pluralistic in that way. Then I think that can really help people along, being able to really consider your perspective in the most charitable light.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to like actually discussing the issue in those environments or contexts, uh, do you find that it's more productive to talk about the base paradigm, compare and contrast why and what we believe versus the premises and the assumptions versus the conclusions of those paradigms within a particular issue, like abortion?
Hmm. I think it really depends on who you're talking to, and just different levels of familiarity, knowing where this person is at as a person, and this is where the virtues actually become really useful. So if you kind of have a well developed sort of just perceptiveness to really understand the moral situation, and to be able to read people, and also understand that not everyone is completely honest when they say things. And
Yeah.
I can tell you, I think it's more of an art than a science. I've been in a situation where I was told by someone that they thought I was being really forward and kind of pushing too hard with someone in a debate who I didn't know as well as my friend, but then was later told by that person that they really appreciated how direct and engaging I was,
Yeah.
and it can work both ways, right?
Yeah.
So I think that again, it's more of an art than a science.
Well, I have the last
Apologies,
question.
I've
Yeah, yeah. Go
our
ahead.
our extra podcast guest is being upset about things.
Yeah, I think it's okay. Maybe we're modeling a way to do podcasts that's not that's a little different.
Yes, hopefully, just so she doesn't grow up to be an emotivist, right? Or
Exactly. So I have the last question about the Christian perspective. Is that something you want to chat, or do you think we're out of time here?
well, I can just say some of what I mentioned earlier about Macintyre becoming a Christian later in life is missing from After Virtue. He doesn't really have this belief in common grace or natural law, and it shows. And I think that just something that we have to keep in mind with all of these prognostications as to the world and where things are at. It can be, you can look around and see where certain things are headed and get really down or depressed, or lose hope. But I think the Christian virtue of hope is really useful there, to say, hey, this is ultimately in God's hands. It's not a project of humankind to redeem itself, to make sure that we get everything right so that we can have virtuous communities. I mean, we have our part to play, but if we can understand that telos, that is, our part is part of a bigger order, and that ultimately God's will be done, then I think that can definitely make for a more hope-filled and positive outlook. Sometimes the news cycle, especially in the last few years, can make you think that nothing could possibly become better.
Yeah, yeah.
Or that people will never learn how to agree, or even agree about their disagreements. If we can understand ourselves as part of a bigger story, and that this is one chapter of it, things could very well turn around.
So I guess what I would wonder there is, because I think I share a lot of the concerns or criticisms of modernity as we experience it, particularly in the political realm. But I think a large segment of the population, particularly, I'll kind of pick on the far right for a moment here. I would agree with some of their contentions, but I think they're going about it in a way that is antagonistic and destructive versus productive. And so how do you reconcile that dynamic in terms of not only recognizing the issues, but also how people are responding to all these issues in ways that are actually tearing things down in a worse way, or accelerating it, or being a part of it?
Yeah. Well, I would say this, right or left, I think that there's not a whole lot of other regarding going on in the rhetorical world. I think, and also I would say that perhaps the left is just better at the masking side of it,
Yeah,
whereas the right, probably because there's sort of a underdog feeling to it, are a
yeah,
little more unmasked in their aggression.
yeah,
All of that is to say, I mean, as Christians, there's a sense in which we have to recognize that you're always called to both love and pray for your neighbor, and your enemy too.
Yeah.
right? So even if you think this person is so wrong that there are dire and fatal consequences, hating them is not really an option.
Yeah.
And in fact, praying for them is what we're asked to do. So I think that's something that everybody needs to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and that doesn't mean that truth is unimportant or that there aren't things that are worth contending for. But I think all of these, again, remembering our purposes in why do you care about this in the first place,
Yeah.
um, and further, if you think that a disagreement is there's incommensurable, so to speak, then maybe this isn't the place for rhetoric, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's a different word is necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. We got through quite a bit there. We had a little bit of commentary from your daughter, Isabel. Um,
Yes.
how can people connect with you? Where are you at on social? What are the websites that you're involved with?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm at Jesse Nigro on Twitter. Feel free to follow me there. Um, I am the editor in chief at northamanglican.com.
Okay.
And I am also starting up a podcast that sort of delves into some secularity, some virtue, and some the role of narrative and storytelling and myth at remembrancer.net.
Remembrancer.net.
So
Cool. I'll put the
yeah,
links to
that's
all that on the page in the notes.
I appreciate it, and
Yeah,
I
and then
appreciate your taking the time with me.
yeah, yeah. And then what about social? Are you active on any channels?
Um, Yeah, I'm on Facebook and Twitter, and that's mostly it for now. Yeah,
All right, sounds good. Anything else you wanted to say that you didn't get a chance to?
I don't think so. No, I just hope that people will delve into this stuff and think hard about it and um, question your institutions and be open to finding yourself in agreement or disagreement, right?
Yeah,
And just because you question something doesn't mean you reject everything either.
yeah.
So um all that being said, don't stop asking questions, and if any of your listeners come looking for me on social, I'll be glad to see them.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for your time.